Hi, the aim of this video today is to examine the role of historical narratives in extremist propaganda, seeking to show how and why they are used to enhance the impact of such propaganda. To that end, using the concept of competitive system of meaning, which lies at the heart of extremist propaganda and forms their grand overreaching narrative, through the use of two constructs, in-group, out-group identity, and crisis solution, propagandists form a cylindrically reinforcing narrative. This video is exploratory in nature and is envisaged as the first step in much more detailed research into the role of historical narratives in extremist propaganda, and it seeks to show the importance of historical narratives to propaganda by identifying and exploring five ways in which such narratives are exploited in order to reinforce the extremist competitive systems of meaning. So the keywords here, if you want, the hashtags are for terrorism, violent extremism, propaganda, and finally strategic communications. So the first thing is to get back onto history as a powerful weapon and some of the fiercest battles that are fought over how it is interpreted. Although extremist groups are fighting in the present, historical narratives are often used to justify their ongoing causes and as a result feature prominently their propaganda's output. When we speak about that, the term propaganda has many negative connotations, but is used pragmatically in order to refer to messaging designed to influence the behavior and attitude of a target audience to achieve political military ends during a certain conflict. While I'm speaking about this, the phenomenon that has been highlighted in recent years is the extensive propaganda output of the Islamic State, the IS. At the heart of the Islamic State propaganda is the notion that the Muslim world is in crisis, facing an existential struggle for survival against the West. Throughout their propaganda, they connect the current conflict to historical struggles with the West, from the Crusades to colonization. Thereby, they strengthen the sense of crisis by presenting it as an ongoing, never ending conflict. Conversely, the solution they propose, a return to the caliphate, is also drawn from the past. The use of historical narrative to strengthen propaganda is, however, not unique to IS or even to other militant Islamist groups. Other groups with different ideological, motivational, and operational tactic, from a national to a supranational view, also rely heavily on history as a justification across their propaganda. A central feature of the provisional IRA's multi-dimension communication strategy, as I'm speaking about it, very important to bring back the provisional Irish Republican Army in terms of strategy of command and functional structure when it comes to terrorism and political violence. It has been speaking in detail about praising the provisional IRA for the group's publicity wing, which formed an intrinsic part of the group's advanced command and functional structure. So these are a few of the examples. As I mentioned, the IS, I spoke about the IRA with its Republican nationalist agenda. That was the consistent reiteration that the centuries of British oppression and occupation were the root cause of the Irish problem. The ultimate removal of the foreign force was seen as the only solution to their perpetual crisis. Likewise, far-right groups such as the Christian identity movements stake their foundation and justification on historical narratives and extensive biblical genealogies to justify their in-group, out-group dynamic and the history of conflict between the groups. Across the whole spectrum of diverse and different extremist groups, historical narratives are often prominent to their propaganda. The question here seeks to being asked is how and why is history used in extremist propaganda? So, to get back on this a little bit, it's very important to examine the role of historical narratives used in propaganda by extremist groups, looking beyond mere justification to see how and why they are used to enhance the impact of such propaganda. How are historical narratives deployed as a communication technique in extremist propaganda? And using the concept of competitive system of meaning, as I spoke about it, in order to light the heart of extremist propaganda forms and their grand overreaching narrative through the use of the in-group, out-group identity and crisis solution constructing, therefore, as I mentioned, a cylindrically reinforcing narrative. It seeks to identify 5 ways in which historical narratives are exploited to reinforce the extremists' competitive system of meaning. First, crisis expansion, with the connecting current events to greater historical trajectories to magnify the depth and resonance of the crisis. Second, solution supports, using historical narratives to strengthen the case for the proposed solution. Third, deepening the in group out group dynamic by exacerbating the distinction between group identities and demonstrating that this is the result of a larger historical trend. Fourth, group legitimacy through drawing on history for cultural appropriation to bolster the claim to legitimacy. And finally, justification using historical prophecies to connect the present to the future and generate motivation for action. As this is a very explorative topic, it's very important to look into the role historical narratives play in extremist propaganda rather than focusing on the propaganda used by one particular group. Very important to draw an example from across a variety of extremist groups. We speak about this given the scope of the topic, the narratives projected by the opponents of the extremist group's narrative will not be explored but could in the future be a suggestion for a similar analysis, as there have been numerous examples of charismatic political leaders who have been similarly drawn on historical narratives to construct and strengthen their political narratives. Such as a comparative analysis would provide a more holistic understanding of the narratives being projected by these extremist groups being analyzed in this context. We can talk about example from three different types of groups, chosen primarily for the illustrative nature. These groups, whose propaganda we will analyze, could include the militant Islamist groups, such as Al Qaeda and the Islamic State, a national separatist group, the Provisional IRA, and right-wing extremists, such as the Nazis and Christian Identity. It is crucial to note that these groups vary in almost every aspect in terms of ideology, motivation, and operational level, and are not comparable beyond the use of historical narratives in their propaganda, selecting them primarily because they demonstrate a compelling set of examples to use for historical narratives in propaganda, each in its own distinct way, and second, for the differences to highlight that is the technique used by the broadest spectrum of groups and movements. The objective is to demonstrate the role that historical narratives play across the extremist propaganda, regardless of ideology and motivation. The 5 ways of historical narratives, meanwhile, are explored in order to outline propaganda of both the invariability employment for many extremist groups. It's very important to choose the example in order to simplify the explanatory value of this topic. Uh, and not to demonstrate that they have a particular application by one or another type of extremist group. Furthermore, it should be noted that this technique is not unique only to extremist group and could be as equally prevalent in political rhetoric and government counter messaging. Very important then to go further on in depth in order to do a research into the use of historical narratives by individual groups and potentially by their opponents as well. Building frameworks of analysis developed within the Counterterrorism Strategy Communication, the CTSC research project, is the best way in order to understand the system of meaning. And this will lead us to speak about the research that has been made in the Counterterrorism Strategy Communication project. And for that, very important to remind the cyclically reinforcing dynamic of extremist propaganda, which is a scheme that involves the in group and the out group and the others. They are with the out group. These are connected through a bifurcated identity constructs. Then the in group is technically getting an effect from the perception of the crisis that includes uncertainty, others, breakdown of tradition, and led the in group for being responsible for a solution that include certainty, reinforcing traditions, and of course the in-group. And this will be characterized by an imbued with positive values situation. The out groups will be responsible to confront the solution from the perception of crisis and will be characterized by an imbued with negative values. This is a little scheme that has been developed, and it's basically an approach for core structures based on the two interlocking dichotomies at the heart of extremist propaganda. Very important to form thereby a competitive system of meaning that brings the readers of this analysis of scheme into an extremist worldview and provides a lens through which to view and interpret the world as prescribed by a particular group. Although the scope of this topic does not allow us to go into details because these groups use the interplay of in-group, out-group identities and crisis solution constructs which are linked together to create cyclically self-reinforcing narratives. This will lead us to the topic that is related to deciphering the siren call of militant Islamist propaganda, meaning in terms of credibility and behavioral change, and it has been studied by the International Center of Counterterrorism in September 2016, the one based in The Hague, in the Netherlands. We can see a three-step process from the scheme I described. First, the in-group, out-group dichotomy constructs is established, and then comes to the dichotomous crisis solution construct. And finally, the messages that connect the crisis to the out-group and the solution to the in-group. What may appear to be disparate messaging across many subjects and types of media is in reality centered and deepening the two dichotomies and strengthening the connections, linking together and mutually reinforcing each other to provide the overreaching grand narrative. Hence, very important to call on the method of the linkage approach, that is referring to how the constructs that make up the system of the meaning are linked together to create the core narrative. Identifying the link is the key to dissecting and understanding the core narrative. In terms of militant Islamist propaganda, the summaries of the core narratives are typically declaring we are the champions and protectors of appropriately aligned Sunni Muslims. In example, the in-group identity, everyone outside of this narrow category are enemies. In example, out-groups identities, responsible for the Ummah. And when I speak about Ummah here, very important to analyze the concept that is generally taken to mean the collective or overall community of adherents to Islam, and it means nation in Arabic. So the Ummah crisis basically are basically coming from the outgroup identities. So support us and our solutions. In example, the in-groups politico-military agenda, whereas the intricacies of the in-group, out-group, and crisis solution construct may vary for different groups, the central dynamics remain roughly the same. Observation of this approach is not unique to Islamist propaganda. Rather, a similarly constructed system of meaning is at the heart of most successful extremist propaganda, although imbued with the particulars of the narrative of each group's cause. Indeed, it is broadly echoed that Mao Zedong on guerrilla warfare. There is the most important topic that has been spoken about the issue of Mao Zedong in 1937. The other issue is about the guerrilla warfare, the Irish Republican Army's reference to 1950, and then there is the issue that has been described in the Handbook for Volunteers of Guevara's in 1961, and the guerrilla warfare and Al-Mukrin of 2003, which is basically also leading us to speak about the practical course for guerrilla wars as another example. And this is an analysis of the Islamic State from an Australian Journal of Political Science, and it has been issued, I think, in 2016. At the highest level, extremists link a specific outgroup to a crisis or crisis and connect the in-group to solutions. But these high-level constructs can be unbundled into a series of more complex links enhanced by a variety of propaganda strategies. Very important to focus specifically on historical narratives as a lever for effective propaganda. If I speak about the power of history as the next topic within this context of action, it's a linkage approach to explore how such linkage can be bundled together to form high level constructs to forge a single idea, demonstrating how extremist propagandists package together multiple sources of evidence to create an apparently self reinforcing argument that is presented as an historical proof, which then is accepted as the truth for a particular scenario. Narrative are constructed through combining historical events with folklore, mythology, religious scripture, and symbolism to create the illusion of a sound argument. So, explaining an example of such a bundle would be an ideological argument that draws connections between a conspiracy theory, which is a scriptural reference, a folkloric tradition, and a real historical event, representing the bundled product as, between quotes, history. And when I refer to that, it's basically when we speak about the theory of extremist construction of identity and how escalating demands for legitimacy shape and define in groups and out group dynamics, which is also on the eighth volume of the number seventh issue of the Hague International Center of Counterterrorism of 2017. These bundles can then be linked with other bundles to construct highly complex interconnected concepts that support an overarching narrative. Working backwards from a group's core narrative, these concepts can be deconstructed by examining linkages and bundles to entangle the complex web that makes up the system of meaning. Using this approach is to identify how historical narratives are exploited to support the construction of the system of meaning at the heart of an extremist propaganda. History, it is often said, is written by the winners, and some of the fiercest battles are often over the interpretation of history and how its narratives are constructed. History is used extensively by extremist propagandists as an evidence to support their narratives, and the use of such historical evidence can have the false appearance of scholarly rigor, which can add to the apparent persuasive power of the narrative. Exploring how historical narratives are used in extremist propaganda through the lens of the system of meaning and its synthesis, setting out the five different ways in which historical narratives have been employed to enhance and reinforce the system of meaning at the heart of extremist propaganda, will lead us to speak about a crisis expansion topic. At the heart of the crisis solution dichotomy, there is the need to escalate indeed the sense of the crisis. The greater of the perception of crisis, the greater the call to action. And the greater the crisis, the easier it is to justify extreme solutions, and so on. One way extremist propaganda has sought to increase the sense of crisis is to stretch it beyond the here and now by connecting it to a wider historical struggle. And such manipulation presents the view that the extent of the crisis transcends the current situation, which is merely the current manifestation of an ongoing historical and possibly existential conflict. In example, the connection of past and present crises is particularly obvious in militant Islamist propaganda. Al Qaeda and IS invariably refer to the West generically as the Crusaders throughout their propaganda output. They seek to conflate the Western Christian Crusades almost a millennium ago with what they perceive as the war currently being waged on the Muslim world by the West. Using this narrative, IS portrayed the West's campaign against their group in Syria as a continuation of the Crusades. Writing, for example, in Dabir, it is yet another crusade, just like the former crusade, led by Richard the Lionheart, Barbossa of Germany, or Louis of France. Likewise, today, when American presidents in the past raised the cross, the Crusader countries immediately scrambled. And this is a very important approach to understand, and it's very detailed in the issue number 7 of Forward of 2015, page 3 exactly. Narratives about the Crusades of the distant past are in turn woven together with narratives about Western colonialism in Muslim countries over the last few centuries, building to a perception of the Muslim world in perpetual struggle against subjugation by the West. One of ISIS's most resonant videos from the period in which they rose to predominance was entitled "The End of Sykes-Picot." As we all know everything about the Sykes-Picot agreement, no need to get back onto that. Very important to mention that it has featured the IS fighters demolishing border posts between Syria and Iraq. The border, a remnant of the Sykes-Picot Agreement between colonial France and Britain to divide up the Arab lands after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, is seen as a symbol of Western Crusader control and the deliberate division of Muslim lands and the roadblock to the return of the Caliphate. In an article that was called "The Birth of the Two New Wilayat," it has been described in Dabiq issue 4 and summing up the following: after demolishing the Syrian-Iraqi borders set up by the Crusader to divide and disunite the Muslims and carve up their lands in order to consolidate their control of the region, the Mujahideen of the Khilafah, which means the fighters of the legacy of the Muslim land, delivered yet another blow to nationalism and the Sykes-Picot inspired borders that define it. The establishment of a new wilaya, Wilayat al-Furat, was announced this month by the Islamic State in an effort to eliminate any remaining traces of the Kufri nationalistic border from the hearts of the Muslims. IS's military advances or establishment of the caliphate are depicted as rolling back old colonial injustices that were imposed on the Middle East, especially after the Sevres Convention after World War One that marked an end of the Ottoman Empire. It was perhaps bin Laden who was the most eloquent in his portrayal of the War on Terror as the continuation of history. In a letter to Al Jazeera in November 2001, bin Laden clearly set out his arguments to brand the USA's response to 9/11, particularly the American-led invasion to Afghanistan as a crusade against Islam, stating that at the time President Bush's description of the war as a crusade makes his point before going on to ask, is it a single unrelated event or is it part of a long series of crusader wars against the Islamic world? Since World War One, which ended over 83 years ago, back then, the entire Islamic world has fallen under the Crusader banners under the British, French, and Italian governments. They divided up the whole world between them, and the territories of the Middle East fell into the hands of the British. The subjective approach of bin Laden has been basically what led to presenting him a perspective through which viewing the Afghan invasion not as a single event but as the latest in a long line of allegedly anti-Muslim action by the West. Having deepened the narrative by connecting the current conflict to a long chain of historical events, he next broadens its setting a litany of violence committed by the Crusaders in recent history against multiple countries in the Muslim world, including Kashmir, Iraq, the territory of Palestine, Chechnya, the Philippines, Timor Leste. Before concluding his argument, we should therefore see events not as isolated incidents but as part of a long chain of conspiracies, a war of annihilation in all senses of the word. Bin Laden basically exploits historical narratives to both broaden and deepen the sense of the crisis. The device of connecting past and present crises also lies at the heart of the narratives used by the provisional Irish Republican movement, or the Provost, the idea of the Irish engaged in a continuous struggle throughout their history. What I mean here by Provost is the Provisional Irish State Republican Movement, that is the branch of the Irish resistance that was formed after Sinn Féin and its military wing, the Irish Republican Army, splitting in 1970 after violent riots that erupted among Catholics protesting repression in Northern Ireland in 1961. It consisted of the Provisional Sinn Féin and its political wing, and the Provisional IRA and its military wing. The provisional branches split off from the original Sinn Féin and IRA because they refused to recognize the legitimacy of Leinster, the Leinster House of Dublin, which is the metonym of the government of the Republic of Ireland; Stormont, which is the Stormont House of Belfast, which was the metonym of the Parliament of Northern Ireland; and Westminster as well, and the Westminster Palace of London, which was the metonym of the Parliament of the UK, demanding that Northern Ireland, then caretaker of Sinn Féin, recognizing any of these governments was an act of treachery. He is quoted as an faux black in the 1970 issue of Afro Black. The official policy of the IRA had been one of the non-violence until the troubles of a period of unrest in Northern Ireland that lasted from 1968 to 1998. On January the 3rd, 1972, also known as Bloody Sunday, the British shot down peaceful protesters demonstrating against the internment of dissidents. This event was a catalyst for increased violence on the part of the resistance as well as government repressions. So this is an endemic theme to the Irish national identity that was renewed in Northern Ireland during the late 1960s, when the Irish Republican Army justified its actions by exploiting existing nationalist ideologies, beliefs, and traditions. As James Downey noted, and when I speak about this, very important to remind the fact that James Downey was a former London editor of the Irish Times, whose work focused on politics of Northern Ireland. So he spoke about this crisis and boldly said that the claim of Provost supporter that the Provosts are fighters, the last campaign to end 800 years of British oppression, and may seem unreal. But there has been enough real oppression over the centuries to give force to this belief. This course basically described an ideology of the provisional movement which successfully drew on historical claims throughout their campaign, throwing off the yoke of the occupying force that has been intrinsic to the Irish struggle, and one of the provisional branch consistently reiterated in their public communication, as the only solution to the Irish question. This was clearly illustrated in the IRA. As you know, IRA is the nickname of the Republic of Ireland, a policy document that has basically mentioned that Sinn Féin has never looked on the endings of British rule in Ireland as the ends in itself, but rather as a means to restore the ownership of Ireland to the people of Ireland. This idea was reiterated in the first issue of Anne Paul Black, published in January 1970, as I mentioned earlier, immediately after the split in the Republican movement. The headline on page 1 read, "On this we stand, the rock of the Republic. Signally, they would not be moved." In short, the provisional IRA framed the Troubles as the continuation of the centuries-old fight British occupation. But we have to always remember the rule of the 20th century in the issue of the Ireland at the global scope, within the concept of the history of the Irish Free State in the beginning of the 20th century to nowadays situation with Northern Ireland being part of the states of the UK and the Republic of Ireland. So, in order to sum up in this context of action, very important to expand the sense of crisis. Propagandists exploit historical narratives by means of temporal stretching through connecting a current crisis to past events, and the propagandist can present the current crisis as something that is bigger, the latest manifestation of an ongoing struggle. Thus, the narratives in militant Islamism and the Irish Republican movement both portray their struggle in terms of latest stage of centuries old conflicts. Doing so heightens the perception of crisis, and current events are not viewed in isolation but as part of a broader historical struggle. This in turn allows the framing of crisis as something that is not transient but a perpetual state, and hence only extreme action will be able to overcome it for the sake of a solution. So this will jump us to speak about the next axis here, and making a synthesis about the solution support. So thus far we have concentrated in this topic on the crisis. However, like I said, the crisis solution dichotomy relies equally on the believability of the solution. That's the whole point. That's the bottom line in this context. The propagandist must demonstrate beyond doubt that the solution is feasible and presents a practical alternative to the status quo. Here again, historical narratives can play a key role invariably by allowing the propaganda to point to a time in history when the proposed solution had been in place, thus providing evidence that it is feasible and effective, as acute as the crisis is now, and may have been in the past. It has been overcome before and therefore can be overcome again. As the heart of ISIS's propaganda juxtaposed against the existential crisis Islam faces in its war against the Crusader West is the group's solution, the restoration of the caliphate. It is endemic throughout their propaganda that re-establishing the caliphate is not only the central objective, but is necessary for achieving all of their other objectives, as stated by the first issue in Dabiq that said the goal of establishing the caliphate, has always been one that occupied the hearts of the Mujahideens, the fighters, since the revival of the jihad this century, speaking about the 21st century. Similarly, the author of the article Khilafah Declared, which celebrates the re-establishment of the caliphate in the parts of Syria and Iraq it controlled, jubilantly exclaimed, all Muslims everywhere, glad tidings to you and expect good. Raise your head high for today by Allah's grace, and have state and khilafah which will return you dignity, might, rights, and leadership. And when we analyze this, very important to read on Dabiq, issue 1 of 2014, the topic about From Hijrah to Khilafah, page 34, and the Khilafah Declared on page 7. ISIS propaganda constantly refers to Prophet Muhammad and the foundation of the original caliphate, presenting this period as the ideal return to, for it was a time of military and cultural dominance of the Islamic Ummah. The first caliphate is frequently praised, for example, in the same issue of Dabiq. By the time of the date of Allah's Messenger, the tribes of Arabia were almost completely united, with all traces of idolatry in the region virtually erased, a phenomenon unknown to historians before that time. Within decades, the impoverished and malnourished few thousand herders, date palm farmers, and traveling for trade, the greatest, most knowledgeable, and most pious generation of the Ummah plowed rough the Roman and Persian empires to become literal masters of lands and people from the Iberian Peninsula to the Himalayas. The greatest achievements of the Islamic Empire for their recruitment narratives to instill the idea that it can be reestablished, and the glorious period under which the Ummah overcame the Crusaders. To strengthen the appeal of an IS-run caliphate, the group's propaganda draws previous Islamic caliphate, often taking specific examples from different caliphates as alternative to the current international system. For example, in an article referencing to the economic crisis of the West at the time, and in particular currency instability, ISIS denounces the establishment of their own currency, the gold dinar, citing the Islamic dinar of the Umayyad Empire. The Islamic dinar appeared in 696 AD, when the Umayyad Empire, based in Damascus at the time, stretched from the Iberian Peninsula to the Indus River in South Asia. Last month, the Islamic States announced the plans to mint their own range of gold dinars and silver dirhams in a move to separate themselves from dollar-linked fiat currencies and to establish their own money as a currency that was intrinsic value. But all this that is described on the meltdown by John Ken Cly in Dabic as well, issue 6 of 2014, in page 58. Very important to mention that the boundaries to get to the Indus River has been reached before the Muslim conquest came at the time of Alexander the Great, and the road to get further into the conquest in Asia was already built up ever since the times of the great king of Macedonia. So very historical, very important to stay on point, and I'm trying to analyze something that basically prove propaganda that is led to being believed subjectively, but we, as a role here on and to context also of defense strategic communication, must stay objective within this context of action. And the weight of culture and history and also multicultural aspect should not interfere within the analysis of the context of action of this topic. By aligning themselves with the Umayyad Caliphate, ISIS positioned themselves as a legitimate state. Proposing a solution to the current crisis was also intrinsic to the appeal of the provisional IRA, to get back to the Irish issue. The solution they put forward drew on the vision mapped by the Republican predecessor, one that called for the restoration of Ireland's four provinces, otherwise known as the Four Green Fields. And this is a very important thing to mention in the culture of Ire. There is an Irish folk song widely known where the four green fields are referenced to Ireland's four historic provinces on the island. So, in this kind of context, in Ireland, the provisionals presented a solution that proposed four democratically elected provincial governments based in the historical Irish provinces of Dáil, Leigh, Ulla, Mooman, and Connacht, anglicised as Leinster, Ulster, Munster, and Connacht. The provisionals' proposal picked holes in the existing status quo and presented an inclusive solution they believed none of the governments in Dublin, Stormont, or Westminster could approve. Their political solution, which proposed Catholic, Protestant, Orange and Green, left and right, to be represented within the provincial system, echoes that of Theobald Wolfe Tone's vision for the island a century past, in which a Catholic, Protestant, and dissenter could retain their identity and still find common identity in Irishmen. The culture of the shires that were established, as we know, administratively on the UK, was never been in the context or explanation of the coat of arms of the built-up Irish Free State, neither with the government of Dublin ever since that time to nowadays. Which means the territorial division of the Republic of Ireland has never wanted to be Britishized, if you want. Reinforcing the in group out group dynamic now, in order to analyze this segment, that relies onto the second of the two dichotomies that I mentioned in the system, meaning the in group out group dynamic. As with the crisis solution construct, the greater the dichotomy appears, the stronger the impact. Here again, history will provide a reservoir of evidence that can be cherry picked and exploited in support of the extremist narrative. In particular, there are two ways in which historical narratives can be employed to strengthen the in group out group dynamic. The first is to provide evidence of the lineage of the two groups, and the second one is to show indeed the historical nature of the struggle between them. The latter has obvious parallels to the crisis expansion narratives outlined within this context, where crisis is portrayed as a part of an ongoing historical struggle. It is slightly different in the fact that it often focuses on demonstrating the characters of the opposing groups. At the root of the most nationalist movements, there is a narrative of a separate ethnic identity that marks the foundation of the nation. Invariably, history is drawn upon to show the uniqueness of this ethnic or that ethnic group, and often its superiority to other nations or races. In his famous book Mein Kampf, Adolf Hitler outlines, of course, the Nazi ideology, writing at length of the German people descending from the Aryan race and drawing examples from history to support his claim of their superiority. even before getting married to Eva Braun before his suicide. He was being asked by the priest on his bunker in Berlin if both of them were from an Aryan race. Of course, Hitler did not answer that question. Eva Braun did by a yes, but before it, Hitler answered. One of his SS bodyguards, I do believe, has just reminded the priest that he's speaking to the Führer, and therefore uh, avoided the question before officially getting him married with Eva Braun. In the issue of chapter 11 on race and people, he was a certain history furnishes us with innumerable instances that prove this law. It shows with a clarity, a startling clarity, that whenever Aryans have mingled their blood with that of an inferior race, the result has been the downfall of the people who were the standard bearers of higher culture. As evidence, he claims that North America come to dominate the American continent because in North America the Teutonic element has kept its racial stock pure and did not mix it with any of the other racial stock, in contrast to Central and South America. Speaking about this example of Hitler Mein Kampf that has been also translated and analyzed, anglicized by James Murphy. It's the first volume, chapter 11, and it's found on this English version on the Hearst and Blackett Ltd. of 1939 in London. The narrative of in-group superiority was completed by pitching the assigned out-group, the common enemy, the Jew, for Hitler. As he declared, the Jew offers most striking contrast to the Aryans. The inferiority and the treachery of the Jews is constantly contrasted with the superiority of the Aryan race, cementing the in-group out-group dynamic. Hitler draws upon numerous examples from history to demonize the Jews as the out-group and to impress upon the reader that this alleged nature of the Jews is not a new phenomenon, but has remained unchanged throughout history. He also describes it as permanent, immutable, and indisputable fact. He connects the alleged action of the Jews in the present to biblical stories. For instance, he writes, the founder of Christianity made no secret indeed of his estimation of the Jewish people. When he found it necessary, he drove those enemies to the human race out of the temple of God, because then, as always, they used religion as means of advancing their commercial interest. Hitler consistently attempted to show basically alleged Jewish prejudices of his own day as a permanent fact unchanging through history. We see then that in Mein Kampf, Hitler uses historical narrative effectively to strengthen the in-group out-group dynamic. By tracing the lineage of the German people back to the Aryans, he employs a historical narrative to define the in-group, firmly drawing the line dividing them from the out-group. There are no shades of gray. Furthermore, he uses historical examples as evidence supporting the superiority of the German people. Next, he clearly defines the Jews as the outgroup and uses historical examples to demonize them. He subjectively draws his example from history to give the perception of the Jewish character as fixed, that they have always been this way and by interference they will always be this way and are unable to change. The reference to Jesus driving the Jews out of the temple is used to connect an event 2 millennia ago to present the present day of the Jews. Another good example of reinforcing the in-group out-group dynamic using historical narrative can be found also when we speak about the issues of Christian identity extremist group and the context of the God's covenant in the Anglo-Saxon culture. Christian identity uses a narrative based on historical events, folklore, scripture, and biblical genealogy to justify the in-group out-group dynamic. On one hand, it is used to legitimize the in-group, the Anglo-Saxon, and on the other hand, to delegitimize the out-group. In some cases, for example, in the Middle East, the Jews and later other races. To demonstrate that the Anglo-Saxon are indeed God's chosen people, a complex historical theory was woven that one of the lost tribes of Israel migrated westward. From them unknowingly, the Anglo-Saxons are descended. The lost tribes are distinct from the present day Jewish people, and as such, they are the true heirs to God's promises. In short, through pseudo scholarity techniques, the adherents of Christian identity aim to increase their in group legitimacy by demonstrating that the Anglo Saxons are in reality the true heirs to the biblical covenants and promises of greatness, referring in this context of action to what has been mentioned in IBID page 11. Very interesting read in this context. Uh, in delegitimizing and ultimately demonizing the outgroup, Christian identity maintains that the Jewish people are in reality descended from Satan, the seed of the serpent. They argue that Jews are descended from Cain, the Bible's first murderer, and Cain was not the son of Adam, but the offspring of Eve, and the serpent from the Garden of Eden, Satan himself. The Satanic descent is ultimately expanded to include all non-Anglo-Saxon races as descended from the same line. In short, by writing their own interpretation of history, the Christian identity theorists provide an apparently solid structure for their predefined in-group and out-group as well, which leads, of course, to checking how history provides the linkage to connect today's in-group and out-group back to the Bible. And this process imbues the Christian identity doctrine of the cultural capital of being derived from such a sacred test. It deepens the notion of the division of the in-group from the out-group by tracing it back to the beginning of time, simultaneously specifying with exactness who belongs to which groups. There is no gray zone, in other words. In their own way, the provisional IRA also used history to reinforce the in-group out-group dynamic through one hand portraying their fight as the continued historic struggle of the Irish against the British occupiers, and on the other providing a historical narrative that is arguing that the foundation of many problems in the island of Ireland are due to external interference by the British over the last centuries. Throughout the literature of the provisional movement, there was a consistent reference to the English colonizer, the imperial occupier, as the ultimate root of all Ireland's problems. Examples also, such as the Norman and English wars of conquest from 1100 to 1850, continue to provide a source of legitimation to the Republican movement for generations. And I would recommend Out of Ashes by White. This is a very good thing to read when it comes to this topic of the Norman and English wars. So the crisis reinforcing narratives that added weight to these claims by depicting all of Ireland's problem as coming from these earlier waves of colonization. Similarly, the Great Irish Famine of the 1840s is often cited as a result of English maladministration, which allowed a cruel killing of half of Ireland's population. Crops continued to be exported from a deprived population to feed the interests of the occupier, something that is a native administration would have never allowed. By connecting this past event to the outgroup, the British occupier, the narrative creates basically the perception of a pattern of behavior. So this reinforced the in-group, out-group dynamic by connecting the present to the past and creating a sense of permanence for the in-group, out-group divide. To summarize this, I will speak about historical narratives being used to strengthen the in-group, out-group dynamic in two main ways. First, the narrative that is used to provide the lineage of both groups in order to define clearly which people belong to which groups. And second, by connecting the current conflict to historical events, the narrative establishes a perception of permanence and such an in-out group dynamic in unchanging and the normal order of things. The implication is that if it has always been like this, only extreme action will make a change. I will get back further soon in another video to speak more about the context of legitimacy and legitimacy, and credibility standing on the shoulders of giants as a topic that gets added to this issue of narratives and propaganda. And going further down on it and describing it, I will also speak about the role of the prophecy in the context of the Back to the Future of this description. So, looking forward to speaking furthermore about this topic very soon. To finish the issue that is related to, as we know, the defense strategy communication, very critical nowadays, in order to complete the better introductory understanding of the problem that are leading the role of historical narratives in extremist propaganda. Thank you. Stay tuned.